notion that we are part of an epic story, and unless you know the biggest story that you're part of, you don't really know how to act in the present. So we looked at what is the kind of shape of the stories that we're part of. And I gave a very broad, I guess, methodology and approach to engaging pop culture. And we talked about, paying serious attention to the actual phenomena itself, not simply the ideas in it, but the colour, the sound, the music, the mood. And we looked at wondering in terms of why this story at this particular time. And then how might we discern how a Christian should approach that? How does this relate to the biblical story? I'll revisit some of that today. And then I talked about dialoguing with other perspectives, and finally how we might create meaningful interaction. But a lot's changed since the superhero theme last year. I don't know if you heard, but you got to brace yourself. I've got some very bad news for you as something that changed since last year. And it is this. Batman has backslid. Did you know that? No. Did you know that? Yeah, he has. I wasn't aware that he slid forward in the first place, but no, he's backslid. And see, what happened is it traces down to Batman 53 in terms of the comic. You might have known that he's been pretty pally with Catwoman for quite some time, and to the point that they basically went to the altar. And as far as I understand it, there was a bit of a problem, is that at the altar, she left him. She left him. And what's happened, though, is as a result, is that this kind of terrible incident of suffering has just thrown him into a quandary. He is stuck, and so what happens is he's got this little panel from it where he's recounting how, look, my dad, he was a Christian. I was kind of brought up with this, he held hello, the immortal soul, heaven, the Father and the Son, giving your will to the Lord, trusting Him with that will. And he said, I put aside believing in a deity or believing in anything that my father thought had saved him. And it's set against a cemetery where Batman was, his parents were, buried. And it's basically saying, this last incident of being left at the altar has just sunk my faith. God used to have a cape and He was looking down from above, but now I don't know if I can believe any of this. Now, one person wrote a comment in response to this and said, newsflash, imaginary being stops believing in another imaginary being. So, some people are like, I really don't care. And you might be thinking, what does this actually matter? How does suffering and skepticism relate to each other? And what's the point of all of this? But I want to suggest that this story is being told in this particular moment because this is actually shining a light on a larger cultural issue. And it's the issue, essentially, of a secular shift, a change in vantage point, a loss of faith widespread in our culture, of trying to work out what this means. So let me give you a couple of symptoms of this loss of faith. You might have seen some of the 2017 faith and belief data, nationally representative. And the big shift is not the rise of other religions, though that's interesting. It's not even the rise of those who are SBNR, spiritual but not religious. That's interesting. But actually the biggest story is the loss of those who used to identify as Christian and now say, I've got no religious identification. The religious nuns, NRIs. And many people have argued that they've predominantly come out of mainline denominations where they had a fairly nominal faith to start with. Like Batman. You can't really tell the difference that his faith made. Did it affect how he treated a vigilante? I really don't know. It seemed largely irrelevant. It was a label, but then he just kind of left that story behind when push came to shove. It just was too much. But what we find is that among those who now say, I've got no religious identification, which, by the way, doesn't equal atheist. It's really important to notice. Percentage of atheists in Australia is probably at most 6 to 10%. Many of these people are agnostic. I just don't know. It's not a high priority. It's largely irrelevant to me. I may be open to it, maybe not. It's just who knows and who can tell. But of this group, half of them said, I prefer, in other words, to religion, I prefer a science and evidence-based approach to life. So what they're implying is that there is a battle between science and religion, and I choose science in that quest. As we look at the data a little bit more, what we find is that if you look at top repellents, they're a particularly hard group of people to engage with. Why? Because they don't actually want to talk about philosophical discussion and debating ideas directly. Some do, but a lot of people are actually turned off by a direct encounter. And therefore we need other angles in on how to engage these big questions of belief. And often they're turned off by miraculous stories. Science and evolution, suffering, supernatural elements, it's kind of a trifecta that seems to draw people away from belief in God. It's almost like people are looking for a reason to leave a faith that doesn't have much substance to them. And it could take suffering. It might be like Batman at the altar. It could be a hard incident. It could be a question or a doubt. That we all seem to be Thomases now. You think of Thomas trying to probe Jesus' side. Jamie Smith has written a great book, How Not to Be Secular. And he engages the work of Charles Taylor. Has anyone heard of Charles Taylor? All right. Charles Taylor, phenomenal guy. He's probably in his 70s now. He's pictured on there on the cover there on the right. He's a Canadian philosopher. He's the kind of person, actually in his work, A Secular Age from 2007. It's about 900 pages with 150 pages of footnotes with whole passages in Greek and in French, not Greek, in German and in French, untranslated. I can't speak those languages. I had to deal with this book a lot in my PhD on secularism. But 10 years on from this, 11 years on from this, there's now probably a dozen books, countless journal articles written trying to unpack what he wrote in this book, A Secular Age. But essentially what he documents is a narrative of how did we go from 500 years ago, where it seemed almost impossible to not believe in God. Pretty much everyone believed in God 500 years ago. And yet now, it's one option among many, and it's a really hard one to hold. How did we get to this place? And he tells the narrative of a secular age, of the loss of faith. But what he tells in that is that there's a lot of subtraction stories. Stories where essentially, as we lost religion, or as science rose up, religion declined, and then we just have modern humanism. But that story doesn't quite capture it. He actually critiques that story at length and says that just obscures the relationship between science and faith, that actually science grew up in large part within a biblical worldview. A worldview in which we recognise that we needed to do something with the world, a rage for order to direct it, and we're also sceptical of how we know because of our brokenness. So we need ways of controlling that. So it's quite a complex narrative, but I want to tell it through a very human story. I've changed the name and hidden the face, but a friend of mine, I'm going to call him Rick. And Rick kind of captures this well. Rick grew up in a fundamentalist Christian background. His family, frankly, by his own confession, were a little bit crazy. Everything was miracle this, miracle that. And basically, he was a real thinking person. It just didn't blend with his engineering-style brain. He now works for the military. He's a very smart guy in an engineering capacity. And he started to become disenchanted with this story. It just didn't seem to gel with the way the world is that he'd learned through science and the like. He started to realise that a lot of these fears that his family held seemed to be more in their heads than in reality. So he became, instead of a porous, open self to something transcendent, instead of open and affected by powers beyond, he basically said, I'm buffered from that. I'm immune from that. I'm not affected by the above and beyond. It's just about the here and the now. And so he started to form a closed spin on the world, that it's just about the here and the now, nothing more than that. Everything's about the imminent frame, something that's tangible in time and space. And his story then became about human flourishing, particularly his own flourishing. How do I have a happy life? Can I form a good relationship? What will I do on the weekend? It was a small story of secular happiness, happiness in the here and now. And this has led to, I guess, freedom, a freedom to be authentic, but at the same time it's led to a malaise in the modern world, an apathy, that he just doesn't feel like there's a weight to life anymore. He actually longs for these times when he did believe in something more. He's even said, I long for this to be true, that there is something more, but it was so stifling that I just don't want it, and I fear if I was to go back to it. But he feels apathetic about life in general. So he gets by, he plays a lot of games, has some fun with some friends, but he feels that life is weightless. Doesn't have the same significance. And Charles Taylor describes this as being cross-pressured, where we feel, whether you're a believer or a non-believer, you feel the cross pressures of moving towards belief or moving towards unbelief, but no one feels fixed. We're all Thomases now. We doubt as we believe. They're not separate categories. So he is in one sense haunted by the sense that there must be something more. There must be something meaningful. But how do we engage this? And how might we engage someone like Rick, who doesn't necessarily want to talk directly about philosophy, although Rick doesn't mind that, but largely he is open to something more, but he's suspicious of it. How do you engage that kind of person who's post-Christian in their attitude, been there, done that, it's irrelevant to me, but he's pre-Christian in his understanding. He doesn't fully have a grasp on what he's actually rejected. He's rejected a stereotype of Christianity, fundamentalism, not actually the real thing. So how do we engage someone like that? Well, what I'm suggesting in this talk is that sci-fi and the arts is like a parallel dimension. You've got Mitch's... this always happens. Rick's like... he's okay with me sharing this, but I'll do... This, every time I try and use this anonymity, I always screw up. I should just tell the name. Anyway, again. But I'm suggesting it's a parallel dimension. You've got his life going on over here, but then you've got this whole other dimension of something more, something above, something beyond, something transcendent. How do we bring them into dialogue with each other? And I'm suggesting that sci-fi is actually a brilliant, brilliant genre for engaging secularists today who are like him. I think it's fantastic. It's material enough to be grounded, so it doesn't set off all these radars that you're just making crap up. But it's mysterious enough to draw him into something more, a what if. Imaginative constructs that challenge his closed universe, his secular spin on the world. And that if we know how to engage gospel conversations, and we can actually not force, but journey with someone through using, taken seriously through using a particular genre, a particular artifact. And I hope that's what you're going to get out of today. And we've already seen a lot of this engaged. But before I can do that, I need to clear up a couple of confusions or objections. You see, for many people, they would say, you can't bring these two together. Once you start to talk about science, you've got to exclude religion. One guy said this. This is Darko Suvin in terms of his understanding of the metamorphosis of science fiction. He said, all attempts to transplant the metaphysical orientation of mythology and religion into science fiction, so putting religion into sci-fi, he says this will only result in private pseudo-myths, in fragmentary fantasies or fairy tales. Another person said you've got to strip out religion or metaphysics in order for it to be sci-fi. So how do religion and sci-fi actually relate to each other? Well, the first point I want to make is that this kind of buys into a secularist worldview to start with, as though sci-fi only deals with what is real in the world, but what is real equals material reality. Well, actually, that's to presuppose a big worldview that says that the universe is closed, therefore there can be nothing more. C.S. Lewis, for instance, he wrote his space trilogy, and because he believes the universe is open, then that features in his sci-fi, because that's the nature of reality. It's only if you've already presupposed that there is nothing above and beyond that it's illegitimate to bring religion and God and these kind of questions into a sci-fi story. So what we actually find is a lot of sci-fi stories do include religious dimensions to it. I just finished reading through Dan Simmons' Hyperion all the way through. Even just watching Venom last night, which frankly, it questions, are there really different categories? I mean, you've got I'm not going to give any spoilers on that, but it's got the, quoting of the story from the Bible of Abraham and Isaac, the supplanting of God by humans through the use of technology. These are blending together as genres. It's not like you can go, hang on, this is science and this is myth. Fantasy and sci-fi blend together in a larger category called speculative fiction, where they relate in many ways, and I'll come back onto that in a second. So I'd say that a lot of materialists who say you can't legitimately go to God and something above and beyond the transcendent, that they actually mistake what limits life, the laws and physics, they mistake that for life itself. Science is great to tell you how the planets move, but it cannot tell you why you should move on the planet. Scientism, materialism, it's an ideology that doesn't even emerge from science itself. Can you actually use science to prove that the only things that are real are material realities? This is actually a presupposition that science itself would question. You've presupposed your definition. So what I'd say is we've got to actually recognise some of the problems in scientism, and C.S. Lewis and many others have exposed that. And I think actually with a postmodern shift that we're in a better position now, as was raised earlier, to not be so concerned about is it fantasy, is it sci-fi. I don't think we're as hard and fast on those categories. Hard sci-fi maybe doesn't have as much of a place for it, but most of the sci-fi that we're dealing with today actually is quite open to these questions. So if we're within this imminent this immanent frame, one person said it's like a glass dome, that every time you start to press into meaningful questions, you headbutt the dome and you're called to go beyond. And at that point, are you open to it or not? You're constantly butting into questions of life, meaning, morality, existence, consciousness, hope, justice. And these big themes cannot be answered purely through science unless you want to reduce all of life to matter in motion. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that C.S. Lewis, and I'll come on to Philip K. Dick in a second, have both pointed out that science and magic are not opposite sides are not opposed to each other necessarily. Actually, in The Abolition of Man and also in That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, both in his non-fiction and in his fiction approach to the same topic essentially, he points out that the high point of magic was at the high point of science. Why? Because they were twin pursuits trying to control the world. Just one used known techniques and the other used unknown techniques, but they were both pragmatic, trying to get control of one's circumstances. So they're not necessarily opposites or opposed to each other. And so we actually find Philip K. Dick, for instance, he was asked about trying to separate out one from the other. And he recognised originally his appeal to science fiction I'll come back on him, he's one of the greatest writers in science fiction. But he said in his early exposure, after reading the Oz books, Wizard of Oz, as a kid, he went looking for hard science, but came across a science fiction magazine. And he said all of a sudden, he said, this magic now coupled with, not with magic wands, but with science. In any case, my view became magic equals science, and science of the future equals magic of today. Arthur Clarke with Clarke's Law, future technology is indistinguishable from magic for us because we don't know how it works. You see that in the Telstra ads. You know, it's magic, how this stuff works. So you actually see them float together. Second point I want to make here, as I said, is that you actually join fantasy and science fiction in a larger category called speculative fiction. They're both speculating with the question, what if? How might we use some type of process to think at a deeper level about big questions that confront us? One of my friends, Sam Maguire, I asked him, can you tell the difference between, he's an author, and I said, can you tell the difference between the two, between what's science and what's fiction in this? And he said, I think they're both a sandbox where the deepest parts of your subconscious can take form as people, places, creatures, and technology. In this kind of fiction, you can create societies that take your own personal ideals, reflect your deepest fears of where the future is headed. But he said, how do we separate them out? He said, well, they resemble each other. He said, I would say fantasy is more often rooted in myth, sci-fi is more rooted in technology, but they blend together in many examples. He said, more often than not, fantasy is set in a period that reflects our past, sci-fi reflects our future, but there's countless examples reverse this too. In my opinion, fantasy attempts to suspend disbelief by telling stories that are true to the heart, whereas sci-fi tells stories that are true to the mind. But they're both speculative. I think that's really important to realise, that they tie together. A great philosopher, Susan Schneider, in her book said that sci-fi takes abstract concepts and embodies them in thought experiments. So it pushes you to basically say, what if this is true? Gabriel McKee talks about this as well. So for a guy like Rick, your engaging sci-fi gives him a space where he can legitimately ask questions, what if, that transcend his secular worldview that's closed in on itself. It gives him a freedom to move in a way that he normally doesn't feel able to. It's a brilliant conversation starter. But we've got to be very careful in this. Can you tell the illusion with the picture? Yeah? Jesus as Neo. Matrix, stops the bullets. And if you've ever noticed, the two natures of Christ, three persons of the Trinity. That's why you see that in religious art often. Okay, it's a brilliant hand position there, showing what that's about. James McGrath, in his book, though, he points out that this conversation between theology and science, or science fiction and the Bible, and I think Paul touched on this last year in his work on Superman, it's crucial, though, that we don't just go, okay, so where's the Jesus figure in this? How do we map Jesus into it? What we actually need to do, he said, it's dangerous to impose a particular religious standpoint that risks distorting both religion and sci-fi in the process. Instead, we need to detect the symbolism that is in them. We need to look at a deeper level of what is this story actually saying and how does it relate. And I think for that, Philip K. Dick is brilliant. Who's read anything by Philip K. Dick? All right, Philip K. Dick is widely regarded as in probably the top 2 or 3 American science fiction writers. He wrote over 50 books in his time, lived from 1928 to 1982. If you're in Japan, he's just considered one of the best writers, full stop. Forget genres. He's written over 150 short stories, and multiple of these have been turned into movies. Think of Adjustment Bureau, Total Recall, is it Payback, Minority Report, and I'm going to look particularly at Blade Runner. But here's a really interesting guy. If anyone wants my research notes, as I said to a few beforehand, basically each of these are sections. I didn't get a chance to turn this into a manuscript. I've got 60 pages of research that I'm just kind of randomly dipping into as we go. I found this a really intriguing topic. But Philip K. Dick said about his own life, I'll read 2 quotes here. One is he said, "People have told me that everything about me, every facet of my life, my psyche, my experiences, dreams and fears are laid out explicitly in my writing, that from the corpus of my work, I can be absolutely and precisely inferred." This is true. So it's really handy to get a sense of that. He said in another passage later on, because his life is as wild as his books. He had 5 wives, countless affairs. He was doing amphetamines like they were going out of fashion. He was writing books in the space of 2 weeks at times, as he was basically in a drug-fueled, crazy situation. I'm going to tell you a bit about some of his later religious experiences, but he was the ultimate what-ifer. No one could ask what-if questions like Philip K. Dick or PKD. They refer to Phil Dickian. It's a neologism. It refers to Phil Dickian as the style of worlds that he creates with a major hook, but just something that opens up your imagination and says, what if? What if this is true? He said in one part, it's not simply what if, but it's, my God, what if? Like it's right in your face. He's just trying to open you up to it. He said later on, he said, my God, my life is exactly like the plot of any one of 10 of my novels or stories, even down to the fake memories and identity. I'm a protagonist from one of PKD's books. So he's looking at his own life thinking, I'm in my own story. And this is why I think is really helpful to us, is that if you want to get at, if you want to engage with someone in conversation, it's helpful to realize that these stories are not written by a non-human. They're written by a person with a backstory, with a life that he wrote whole characters into his novels. So by pressing into the story, you discover the person. By discovering the person, you find a bridge to that parallel dimension. And I think that's helpful to realize. So, yeah, so I just find him a really intriguing character. Now, you probably know with Blade Runner, who's seen Blade Runner or Blade Runner 2049? Oh, praise God that there's a number of you have, because I've been watching the hands and I'm like getting nervous as to who's seen anything. This is the pop culture conference, people, so watch something. But in terms of this story, it actually started with his book from 1966. I put 68 there was one of the original publications, but Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? What a great title. And we're going to unpack that as we go. Unfortunately, he died in 1981, 4 months before Blade Runner hit the screen. Yeah, just missed out. He was even suggesting who should play different roles. Conspiracy theory if you want, I don't know, fits with his life. But Blade Runner, shot in 1982, but it's intriguing to me, it only occurred to me last night that it's set in Los Angeles, 2019. There's a hell of a lot's got to change in Los Angeles in the next year for this to come off. I think he was more visionary than he realised. And I suspect the same will happen when we get to 2049 and look at the 2017 version of this. Now, there's differences between them. And you find that the screenwriter, whether that's Hampton Fancher, who was involved in both projects as a screenwriter, or Denis Villeneuve in terms of Blade Runner as the director, or Ridley Scott with the 1982, there are differences. I'll draw some out, but I want to treat them as one canvas, if that's okay, for the sake of this, because I think they fit within the one conceptual world, even as there are some differences between them. But the basic story, as we'll come up on the way through, basic story is set in the future, 2019 onwards, and essentially we have, through World War Terminus, screwed the world over. There is dust that is descending on everything, radioactive dust. Animals, starting with the owls, have died out because they couldn't deal with it. People then, this new religion of mercerism rises, which is all about empathy and caring for things, because we've been a solo animal, but unless we learn to care, everything's going to die. So having a real animal, if you have one, that is prized, because everything's dying. And so people even have artificial animals to be able to show their status and pretending that they're the real thing, as though I'm a caring person. His humour is fantastic in his works. There's so much humour on the way through, a lot of irony. And in this context, you've got the Tyrrell Corporation, or the Rosen Association in the book, same thing, changes name, but I'll just go with Tyrrell. This corporation essentially builds androids because they need to develop off-world colonies. But to do that, you need slave labour, and that's how we've risen in the past, so they build androids to be slave labour. Call them Andes or replicants, whatever you want. They end up rising up because the latest versions, like the Nexus 6 or the Nexus 8 in the 2049 version, these androids are increasingly hard to detect as separate from humans. Originally, they got a 4-year lifespan. Later on, it's an open lifespan, but they can't replicate replicants. There's an uprising. They kill off some humans. They return to Earth to try and find some safety, and in the process, they hire bounty hunters or blade runners. Harrison Ford in the original, and then Ryan Gosling in the 2049. They hire blade runners essentially to execute these androids. Why can they execute them? Because they're not human. And they call it retiring them. That's the premise of the whole story. And I'll pick up some from 2049 later on. So what do we do with this? In the background, it'll have a little bit of some of the vision passing on and some of the soundtrack. Phil Dick was massive into classical music, so he... I don't know if it was his suggestion or if they just chose, but they got a Greek composer, Vangelis, to actually put together the soundtrack, which is stunning. And so I've given you the sense of this. We've got Rick Deckard. Rick Deckard is essentially the first bounty hunter or the Blade Runner. Then we've got Kay, later named as Joe in the later version. World War Terminus, where everything's screwed up. Dust is settling, that uses this word kipple. Kipple is a word that Phil Dick liked to use, which represents entropy, the accumulation of junk. It's just kipple. Everything's running down. We're accumulating kipple. Everything's been kipplerized. And we've got characters like John Isidore or J.F. Sebastian in the movie, who basically is called a special. Basically, he's a chicken head. He's someone who's been so affected by the radiation that he's losing his IQ. Is he still human? Are people with disabilities still human? Because they've got lowered capacities. He's raising these questions. So he's a special, but he's noted for his empathy. We've got other things like, again, off-world colonies, slaves, the Rosen Association, Tyrrell Corporation. Neander Wallace in the 2049 is the head of that association. He's blind is quite an interesting point. Uses a lot of images of the eyes all the way through. Eyes is crucial in these stories. Nexus 6 is in the 2019 one. The Nexus 6 is the kind of the first wave of these replicants that are very hard to distinguish from humans because they're just as smart, they're even stronger, but they don't seem to have empathy. So they use tests. You think of who was the first famous test? Turing test. Alan Turing. How can you tell a human from an artificial intelligence? Well, you've got to have a personal encounter with them. He's playing on this kind of thing. So you've got these tests such as the Voight-Kampff test. And again, the care for animals in this sense of retiring these creatures, and mercerism is the religion of the day, which is trying to get people to be empathic, to care for each other. Now that's a very quick insight into all of those different aspects. But what I want to do is talk about how to engage these kind of questions. So how might I then take a phenomenon like Blade Runner and engage with a guy like Rick? Now, last time when I did this, I suggested that using the shape of the biblical story is much better than finding a Christ type. The biblical story in broad sense, creation, fall, redemption, restoration or mission, and consummation. So we've got this kind of, we're designed for good, creation, damaged by evil, turned inwards, restored for better through Jesus, sent together to heal in the power of the Spirit, the church, on mission, and finally we're waiting for when God sets everything right. Heaven comes to earth, a new creation. And I suggested last time that broad conversational points are things like looking at design for good. When were you truly happy? What makes you feel alive? Damaged by evil, what are your deepest hurts? Who do you turn to for help? What are your saviour figures? What causes or brokenness do you want to heal? How do you engage the brokenness of the world? What animates you as a mission? And what kind of hope do you have? So I use these questions, but I want to drive this a little bit deeper for sci-fi in particular and give you some core questions that you might use in engaging with someone in sci-fi. Has anyone ever read or heard of Edwin Abbott's book, Flatland? Originally the subtitle was A Romance in Many Dimensions, later titled A Parable of Spiritual Dimensions. You see this picture here. It basically tells a story of a line, a square, and a sphere. You can see you've got one dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension. And what he says is, from the perspective of the higher dimension, you can see the lower dimension, but you can't see something above you. A line treats every square as just multiple lines. A square treats a sphere as just different circles as it encounters it. And so it raises this question of, is there a higher dimension? And again, I'm suggesting that sci-fi, the gospel, can intersect this kind of flatland that is secularism today. It can impact it. But how do we do that? And I think what we need to do is look for these kind of signs in these movies, these signals of transcendence. That's from Peter Berger in his language, sociologically. Look for these signs that there is something more. As you see the phenomena of the movie or the person headbutt the glass dome, what lies beyond? So I'm going to briefly look at some stuff from Epic Story, the nature of the story, look at Blade Runner as a phenomenon, bounce off Philip K. Dick's life, and then just suggest one question you could ask. And we're going to do that pretty quick. So the first one, what does it mean to be human? The story of creation, that God made us to love Him, love others, cultivate the world. But how does this come up in these kind of movies? I'm going to watch a 3-minute clip. That's longer than the other clips I'll play, but this is a clip from 2049. Okay? And what happens is essentially they discover bones from one of the replicants. It's got a code number on it, but what they realise is that this replicant actually died in childbirth. Start to hear the biblical allusions. It even says in the story, and the Lord God heard Rachel's pleas and He opened her womb. It actually quotes that in the movie. So they discover that this replicant had a child. What does that mean for what it means to be human? Let's watch this clip. It's not very loud, but it's worth discussing. It goes for a few minutes. And it finishes with a Voigt-Kampf test, going back to the original movie.
That's not possible. She was a replicant. Pregnant. The world is built on a wall. It separates kind. Tell either side there's no wall, you got a war. Or a slaughter. So what you saw didn't happen.
Guess not.
It is my job to keep order. That's what we do here. We keep order.
You want to go?
Erase everything.
Even the child?
I'll trace. You have anything more to say?
I never retired something that was born before.
What's the difference?
To be born is to have a soul in it.
Are you telling me no?
I wasn't aware there was an option there.
Attaboy. Hey, you've been getting on fine without one.
What's that mean?
A soul.
I will actually skip over the second half of the clip at that point because just because of time. But it gets into the Voigt-Kampf test. And one of the points I want to make here is that for Philip K. Dick, as he looked at this whole situation of this big question, it's his first question, what does it mean to be human? Is that he came to the conclusion that the key distinguishing factor about being a human is not your IQ. John Isidore, J.F. Sebastian, they may be special in terms of intelligence, But the key defining criteria of what it means to be human is empathy. An ability to see beyond yourself and actually connect with the other. An ability to love. And that comes through in these movies in multiple ways. It's not until they actually start to see the other, not as just an other, but as someone to be loved, that everything is humanized. And that even if something is seen to be somewhat fake, it still has value. So this is something that comes up in this. So we see, for instance, questions of the image of God, making creatures in our own image. Questions of soul. It touches on memory. If memories are implanted, do you have a real identity? How do you form your identity? What role does memory play in that? And again, how do you test for the difference between? So these are some of the big themes in that. So I move to the second one, the fall. So we're designed for good, but now we're damaged by evil. We turned inwards and made it about us. So what does this actually look like? Well, I don't have a clip with this one, but in this it's interesting that the eyes is such a major feature. In the Bible it says that the eyes are the what? Window to the soul. So if you don't have a soul, then what do you see when you look in someone else's eyes? It reflects. It's a one-way conversation. It's a monologue. So the eyes are not something that you just see out of, they're something you see into. And so in this story, it has reflective eyes all the way through for those who are replicants. And it raises the tantalizing question of whether the Blade Runner, certainly in the first one, is actually a replicant or a human being. In the second one, definitely replicant. It uses this word ersatz, which means a substitute of inferior quality. It uses ersatz for animals, for fur, for authority. There's a fakeness. It goes deeper than the question of what is true, but it actually goes to the question of can you tell a fake? What is real? And how do you deal with deception, implanted memories? It deals with the brokenness through things like retiring of Andes, retiring of the replicants. So you've got all these kind of big issues emerging. So I want to suggest again, the major question you're looking for here for conversation, whether it's with Rick or one of your secular friends, is this question of how can you tell what's real or fake? That's a really crucial question. Third one, redemption. There'll be a clip playing in the background. Don't worry too much. It's just kind of rolling on. This is from the end of the first one. Probably won't get to the end of that clip. But it's reflecting as Rick Deckard is now being hunted down. He was the hunter. He's now being hunted down by Roy Batty, who is the smartest of the replicants in that first movie. And he goes from this, I'm chasing him down to he's chasing me down to I think I'm going to die. And he's got this upward climb through this movie. And in the story, in the actual book, it talks all the time about the climb up the hill, almost like Golgotha, Jesus climbing up to the skull. And it's got this, we're all fighting entropy, we're all trying to climb against, but we actually need grace, and there's death is coming to us all. And so in this, at the end, he goes from being hunted by this guy to suddenly realizing that actually I've got nothing left, and I'm going to drown and sink without help. And it actually ends up being the symbol of death that catches him as he's about to fall to his death, catches him, lifts him up, and that symbol of death is used by the clutching hand. These characters, as they're moving towards death, their hands start to clutch, and he actually stabs a nail through his hand to stop it from closing. So when he catches Deckard and lifts him onto the building, you actually have this beautiful scene where it's got the nail hanging out of his hand, grabbing the wrist of Deckard and lifting him up onto the building. And then you've got the symbolism of this replicant holding a dove as he jumps across the building to lift him up, and then as he dies, he releases a white dove, and he does so in peace, and the music changes to an angelic kind of feel. It's just so explicit in terms of symbolism. Grace alone will save you, and that's something that Philip K. Dick came to realise is only grace will be able to help me out of this terrible situation that I'm in right now. I need something from beyond. And this is the question that's asked here, as it uses all of these symbols, is who or what will save us? Look in all the sci-fi. Salvation is a key theme. It's often dealing with particular incidents, like salvation from a war, salvation from fallout, but it's still dealing with the question of who or what will save us. It's interesting in Philip K. Dick's life that his twin sister, when he was very young, her name was Jane, his twin sister died, and it was the major event that shifted his psychology through his whole life. He always lived in fear of death, and he always had this sense that he needed affirmation by a woman, by his mother, by his sister. His whole life was shaped by the search for salvation from the dark-haired girl every one of his movies and stories has a dark-haired woman in it who he goes to for salvation. He believed he could save people or they would save him. It was a substitute salvation. And he came to realize later in his life that this was actually the search for God, but it was always embodied in a dark-haired girl. We'll come back onto that theme. But what is the symbol of salvation? There you go. Here's the one with the... as he lifts him up. Symbol of salvation. So I'll go to the next one here. What is the purpose of our existence? We're almost finished here. What's the purpose of our existence? So we know that in the biblical story, we're sent together to heal. So is our purpose to go off-world, to escape, to comfort? Is it in animal care? Is it in friendship, as we see with John Isidore? A simple guy taking in people and showing them hospitality to the alien, to the stranger, to the android. Is it dying for a cause? There's a brilliant line in there that there is nothing more human than dying for a cause. I won't play the clip on that one because of time, but there's this sense of mission where they're called to something bigger than themselves. And this is the question you're looking for, is what is the purpose of our existence? We'll skip past that clip. And so what are we actually living for? What is our mission? And the last one here, it'll just be playing in the background with the end of the 2049 version. At the end of the 2049 version, all the way through, you have red dust descending, representing everything being turned into kipple, everything running down, entropy. It's affecting us all. But at the end of the movie, it actually uses snow descending, whiteness representing purity and holiness. He's basically, spoiler, he's basically found the child of the replicant, Rachel's child, and then brings Deckard from the first movie, brings him to reunion with his daughter. And in the symbol of reunion, him having lived out his mission, he discovers his own salvation and he's able to die in peace. In the book, it talks about Deckard having a long, restful sleep, a peaceful sleep, that he didn't have to sit up in fear and anxiety anymore. And Philip K. Dick was riddled with anxiety, fear of death, vertigo, choose your problem. He had it. All the way through, we see this kind of issue of fear. But it was only when he actually discovered God's grace that he found some type of peace in this. And he found that it wasn't simply through a woman image, but it was actually through God and even the mother love of God, if you want to put it in such a language. So, unfortunately, I just need to bring it to the last couple of slides very briefly. And I just want to highlight that that Philip K. Dick, whilst I wouldn't necessarily call him a Christian, though many people had said that he, in his essence, by the time that he'd passed away, he actually held a big cross. He identified with it. He identified the language of God or the voice of God, identified with the Christ. But there was a lot of Gnosticism thrown in, and there was some Vedas and some interesting, in terms of the Hindu beliefs, all kinds of fusion of different type of beliefs. But he had in what he calls 2374, February, March 1974. He had a lady who came to deliver his medication to the door, and he noticed she had a gold pendant with a fish on it. And he said, "What's with that?" And she told him it's a symbol of Christianity. And as he saw that, very shortly afterwards, and she was a dark-haired girl, very shortly afterwards, he had 2 months where he received pretty much constant, whether you want to call it hallucinations or you want to call it revelation, encounters, religious experiences. He wrote out of that exegesis, 8,000 pages trying to unpack this experience, 8,000 pages. Culminated in his book, Valis, where he actually talked about this virtual, kind of artificial living intelligence system, which for him was another name for God. And he spoke about these experiences and basically said that I found something that actually fought for me, that freed me. He had a final experience in his life in 1979 through to 1980, where basically he encountered this vision again, and this vision revealed itself as Yahweh, as essentially as God, and said, "You come up with all your hypotheses, but I want to say at the end of each of those multiple hypotheses is infinity. You come up with as many as you want, you're always going to get infinite options. And what is infinity? But God. You can play at this game as long as you want, but you'll always come back to God." And basically he then closed his exegesis and assumed that he'd actually been led towards God. Now he continued to question. That's his nature. But it was this hypothesizing, and William James, Varieties of Religious Experience, was his favourite book. He carried a copy with him a lot of places he went to. He used to give away annotated copies of it. And he says at the end of section 16, or book 17, he says that these mystical experiences offer us hypotheses which we can voluntarily ignore, but which as thinkers we cannot possibly upset, and that maybe these are actually insight into the truest identity of what it means to be human. And I want to finish this by saying that my friend Rick, it's actually been the signal of transcendence of having a child, of having his own baby, made in his image, as he's discovered love and hope, that he's actually returned to the original language of his faith. He doesn't yet identify as a Christian, maybe he never will, I don't know. He's a lot like Philip K. Dick. But basically what he said is this, similar experience to Pascal, but he just said, I need grace. He said, I've always got questions about the details, but what I do know is that this is my first language, and this is basically something that I actually need. And I think that that's great. And he basically said, I am moving closer to faith. He said this, I guess this vision of how to deal with suffering has become profound to me, to the point where even though I question the factual basis for it, I want it. So my hope is that we might have the integrity, like with the endeavour of science, to probe, to question, to test, to use these artefacts to actually go deeper, and that we might approach that with the same vigour as we would science. That we wouldn't just throw it out, but we'd allow these hypothesising, all of these questions to draw us and to look along the beam towards the source from which they come, the source of truth, of goodness and of beauty. And I think Philip K. Dick is a wonderful model for us towards that end. So I hope that's been an interesting session for you. Again, these slides, if you want to get the slides, bit.ly/gospel sci-fi, or you can email me and I'm happy to send you the research notes and the slides. So bless you each.
Okay.